LiSTNR production.
Two cousins, both wives to the same man, found dead under mysterious circumstances. Was this the world's unluckiest husband or a serial wife killer? Former detective Peter Seymour has dedicated over 2 decades of his life to the people of Western Sydney, serving in the New South Wales Police as both a detective and police prosecutor. In this week's Rewind episode, Brent Sanders talks to Peter about the shockingly bizarre investigation of Thomas Keir and the life-altering case that pushed Peter to his limits, prompting him to make a critical decision that changed the course of his career.
I went out to the house a number of times and could never find anyone there. And eventually one afternoon shift, late one night, we were going past, just on spec, heading back to the station, and I saw the light on. So we stopped in, and that's my first meeting with her husband, Thomas Keir. And it was one of those strange, eerie sort of feelings you get when you rock up to a place and you just have a particular vibe about it. And anyway, that night, he couldn't give us any further information. He said she was alive. He'd spoken to her. She'd taken off with another guy and was living somewhere. He didn't know where. And then, as fate would happen, a couple of young blokes who'd had too much to drink drove into the police car, our detective's car, parked alongside his house. So we ended up getting into a scuffle with them, and they got arrested, and Thomas Keir was our witness. He saw it all and ended up giving evidence in court. So it's
bizarre.
It is. It's a strange set of circumstances, my dealings with him.
You say it started out as a missing persons case. Reported by whom?
Well, initially her family, and then Thomas Keir ended up coming forward. The family, after a few days of her disappearing, reported her missing to Mount Druitt Police Station. But he didn't do it up front. As far as his story was, she'd taken off, and that was the end of it.
So she's still missing?
Yes.
And I guess we could use it's like a cold case. She hasn't turned up, there's been no contact, but there's also no evidence as to any foul play or anything such as that could lead to an investigation. So we're sort of things are in a state of flux, really. In a state of flux.
Yeah, because the family had no further information. They were hoping, I suppose, that she was still alive. His story to them and to police was that she was alive. He'd spoken to her. He says that she rang him at home a couple of times 6 months after she disappeared, wouldn't tell him where she was, just that she'd taken off with someone. And so that's the story that was being played out, and the family accepted that.
Young child involved, your 3-year-old child, I think, that was still in the custody of Keir, obviously, at that time.
Yes.
Yeah. So then we get to a point, what are we, about 3 years down the track, and is it coincidence that he ends up meeting a woman who's actually the cousin of his first wife? Did he know that?
Well, how it all came about is Jean's mother still hoped that Jean was alive somewhere. And in her mind, if she introduced Keir to another woman and he had another relationship, she was hoping that this might somehow flush Jean out and make contact with him if she knew that Keir was seeing someone else. So at a family get-together, Christine introduced Tom to Rosalina, who'd come out from the Philippines for this family gathering. And he ended up following her back to the Philippines. They married over there, and then he brought her back to Australia.
So they're back now married, back living in Sydney?
That's correct. They were living with Tom's parents out at Mount Druitt because Tom had a tenant in his house, a lady who had a young son. And when he came back with Rosalina, they stayed at his parents' place. And then one day the tenant complained to him about a foul smell coming from somewhere around the house that she couldn't get rid of and didn't know what it was. And he terminated their rental agreement and got rid of them. And then it wasn't long after that he went back to the house, and we are aware of him pulling up the floorboards in the hallway of the house and digging the dirt up, because a colleague of his dropped in unannounced one day and saw him and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, there's a bad smell here. I'm trying to find it and get rid of it."
And what was it?
In my mind, it was Jean's body that he was digging up.
Right.
Because what had happened after Tom had terminated the rental agreement of his tenants, he's then moved into the house with Rosalina. But before that, my opinion is, and I spoke to the Crown about this, that Tom's had to exhume the body that he'd buried under the house, this is Jean's body, and get rid of it before he could move in with Rosalina.
So you believe his evidence pointed towards him having exhumed the body of his first wife, and we're now, time-wise, about 3 years down the track.
Yes.
He's remarried Rosalina, first wife's cousin, and he's now moved back into that home. They're married for about 4 years and things start to go awry. Is that
Yeah, I
right?
don't think it was that long.
Right.
With both marriages, things started to fall apart fairly quickly.
Right.
He was very controlling. There's evidence from Jean's family and friends that he would alter her clothes if he thought they were too revealing. Family and friends, in statements to us, portrayed Jean as going from a very vibrant, effervescent, bubbly young woman to someone who's very withdrawn. She'd often wear sunglasses, and she was just a shadow of her former self, not long into the marriage. And then she needed time away. She told one of her friends that she had to leave, but she was scared that Keir wouldn't let her take their son. So she went down the caravan park down the south coast with her sister and her sister's boyfriend just to have a week to herself. And he came down a couple of days early and dragged her into the car and said, "You're coming back home." And then on the way back, they stopped at a service station and she went to the toilet, climbed out and took off and went back to Bondi to a gentleman she'd had a one-night stand with. That night, Keir contacted this gentleman because he was aware of the previous affair, and he'd actually confronted this fellow sometime earlier. Anyway, he rang him and he said, "Yeah, Jean's here," and told him to bring her home, which he did that night, and that was the last independent sighting of Jean.
An extremely jealous man. I think you've said, Peter, in previous interviews, even to the point of being jealous of attention that the son would pay to the son's mother.
Yeah.
And quite bizarre.
Yeah, it was. Michael was only just a little baby.
Yeah.
And Jean, there was evidence that Tom came home one day, Jean was in the bath, just had Michael on her chest, and he didn't like it. You know, and it's the most natural thing in the world. And yet, no. She wasn't allowed to have that sort of contact.
So the first wife, Jean, sad goes missing. All indicators in hindsight that he's involved in that. He's now in his second marriage with Rosalie. That goes horribly, horribly wrong as well.
Yes, it does. And she wasn't allowed to mix without him knowing. When I say mix with other people and without him knowing about it. And I was at home actually about to start afternoon shift at 3:00 when I got the call a couple of hours earlier that there was a fire at this particular address, and there was a female body found in that fire in the main bedroom, and I was called in early. And on the way in, the address rang a bell with me, and then all of a sudden it dawned on me who it was. And when I got there, I was expecting that it was, because I was told it was this gentleman's wife, Keir's wife, so I thought straight away it's Jean.
Oh, that
might have come back.
She's come back, yeah, because you've had no dealings with him for a
couple of years.
Yes.
So when I got there and it said, "Oh, it's his wife, Jean," I was told, "Well, no, it's not Jean. Her name's Rosalina. He's remarried." And that's when the alarm bells really went off.
I bet.
They were already ringing,
Yeah, of course.
If it was Jean, her body's there, and she'd taken off, had an affair, if she's come back, things might not have gone well again. But to then find out, no, he's remarried and it's his second wife, and then very quickly it became apparent that he was the last person seen entering the house and then leaving. And within about 10 minutes of him leaving, there was smoke and flames coming out from under the eaves. No one else was seen going in or out of the property. He straight away was the main suspect.
So when you arrive, what state is the house? Are you able to gain entry at that point? You got the fireys there, the whole 9 yards.
There was a lot of people there.
Yeah.
The fire brigade were there, scientific were in attendance. There was a lot of police at the scene, and it was a little while before I went into the house, once it was rendered safe by the fireys, to go in with scientific and look at the scene, have a look at where the fire had been through the house, the body, and then I went back in a bit later on when the forensic pathologist arrived to examine the body.
So you're a detective, mate. You've been around the block a few times. You're either looking at a bloke that's had some shocking bad luck and innocently lost 2 wives, or we're looking at a bloke who's there's a double homicide.
That's it in a nutshell.
So he would have been taken into custody shortly after that. You would have.
Yeah, he was. Detective Sergeant Mick Lyons was in charge of that. I'd spoken to Mick at the scene. We'd gone over things and a decision was made. Mick was satisfied that Thomas Keir would be arrested and taken back to Mount Druitt Police Station. And I said to him, I'd like to start looking back over Jean's disappearance, because now that we've got Rosalina dead and Thomas Keir, the main suspect for that, and he was ultimately charged with it, I was then naturally really concerned about what had happened to Jean.
Jean's body, you believe, was exhumed from under the house. Was there any evidence to go back to that identified her as having been buried under that house?
Well, when I started talking to neighbours, we got information from a couple of them that they'd seen Tom bury a lot of things in the backyard. Car engine, car panels, fencing panels, and also a 44-gallon drum. So that was the main thing of concern. Had he buried her in that drum? And she was buried in the backyard somewhere. So we ultimately got a search warrant and got a backhoe in and dug up the whole backyard that we could reach with the backhoe. We found everything that the neighbours said they'd seen him bury, apart from the 44-gallon drum. So when we looked at it, I thought, well, if he's buried all these things and buried a drum, and if he's exhumed the body, which was the likely scenario based on information that we'd gathered, then the strong view was that he'd lifted the body up, put it in the drum, and then got rid of the drum. But there was a part of the property that we couldn't get to with the backhoe, and that was down the western side of the house, between the house and the fence. It was only a few feet.
Too narrow to get the backhoe.
Yeah. And it was the second search warrant that ultimately found the 7 bones in that area along the western edge of the house, alongside a brick pier, and that was due to a prison informant coming forward. See, when Keir was charged with Rosalina's murder, he spent a bit of time in jail on remand, and in that time he spoke to an inmate and told him that he'd killed Jean, his first wife, and buried her under the house. And that inmate told a second inmate who had an upcoming Supreme Court bail hearing, and he took the opportunity to put it on Keir basically as to what happened, which he did in the yard one day. And he came forward with the information that he buried her upright alongside one of the brick piers under the house. So with that information, and there were things that this inmate said to me when I went and interviewed him at Long Bay Jail that he could not have possibly have known unless he'd got that from Keir. Such as Keir saying that his first wife had rung him a few months after she allegedly disappeared. And that's something he told us, but that was never released, never divulged in the media or anywhere. That was just known to us. And yet the prison informant told me about that. He said he initially said, oh, no, she's still alive. He said, but then when I told him what I knew, he said he had a cup with a drink in it. He said he shook that much, he nearly spilled it. And he said, I know what you've done. And then he walked away from him. And that's when they contacted us from the jail.
And as a result of information that you receive, you can now, you do a little bit more of an extensive search, and ultimately there was some, I think 7 bones that were found that were linked through DNA back to Jean. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well,
yes.
Because of this information that she was buried under the house, that's where the search then commenced. And the house is on brick piers, and on the western side, you had the piers were 3 foot maybe high before you hit the floor, so you could get in easily under there. And then it tapered off to nearly nothing when you got to the eastern side of the house. So we started under the house on the western side naturally, and the scientific went in, and anywhere they thought the ground seemed to have been a bit different, a bit disturbed, that's where we'd start digging. And it was during one of the uniformed police officers was having a bit of a break, and he was on the western side, and he just started digging around one of the brick piers there, and he was about 18 inches down and came across a bone. So handed it to one of the detectives there, who then brought it to me. And I said, look, I don't know the difference between a human bone and a chicken bone. A bone's a bone. Let's get it bagged, back, entered in the exhibit book, and down to the pathologist. And it was the next day that bone was confirmed as a human finger bone.
And further DNA tests, I guess, identified who that was.
Yeah, ultimately, DNA was carried out. Well, we eventually found 7 bones during that search. And the first DNA testing was done. I took them down to Melbourne. There was DNA testing done in Sydney, but back in those days, the early 90s, DNA testing in Australia was in its infancy.
Yeah.
We weren't real advanced in it. And down in Melbourne, they got a positive result, but they couldn't duplicate it. And the forensic pathologist down there told me, look, you really want the best on this, and America are the best. And that's where you need to take them. And so we were matching the DNA from the bones with blood from the parents. And the bizarre part of that story is that, and we didn't know until we approached Jean's mum and said, look, we need blood from you and Clifford, as Jean's parents, to test with the DNA we get from the bones. And she said, Clifford's not Jean's biological father. So Christine was pregnant with Jean when she married Clifford. He took Jean on as if she was his own daughter.
Right.
But as fate would have it, Christine still knew where Jean's biological father was, and he lived in Sydney. We tracked him down, and he confirmed that, yes, he was Jean's biological father, and he was happy to assist and provide a blood sample for the DNA testing.
So Thomas Keir's charged with 2 homicides?
He was initially charged with Rosalina's,
yes,
and subsequently acquitted. During that process, we were still investigating Jean's disappearance. So it wasn't for some years later, after he was acquitted of Rosalina's murder, that he was charged with Jean's murder, and then subsequently went through 3 trials before the final verdict.
Which was?
He was guilty. The first trial, before a jury, it was found that the judge had made an error in addressing the jury on how to interpret the DNA evidence. The DNA evidence was so intricate, and you're talking about percentages and ratios of 1 in 600,000 in the community matching the DNA. So I can see how it got miscommunicated.
Yes.
But still in all, it was grounds for appeal. So there was a second trial. And the problem with that, you go through a trial of 6 to 8 weeks, you get a guilty verdict, the family think it's all over. And then all of a sudden you've got to go back to the family and say, look, I'm sorry, this has happened, a new trial.
We could do it all again.
You've got to relive this nightmare all over again. And that was difficult.
Yeah.
But we did. We went through the second trial. It basically ran like the first. And again, the jury found him guilty of Jean's murder. But then after the trial, some of the jurors were having a drink at the pub across the road from the Supreme Court. Defence barrister went over there too and heard them talking and spoke to them. And one of the jurors admitted that he'd looked Thomas Keir up and saw that he was acquitted of Rosalina's murder some years earlier.
Right.
So armed with that information, he went straight back to the Court of Criminal Appeal. Retrial, biased jury. So we had a third trial, and in the third trial, it was before a judge alone.
Yes.
Again, the evidence basically ran the same, and the judge came back with a guilty verdict.
Goodness me, what a long drawn out. So from when we believe that that Jean life was taken, we're sort of talking 1988, thereabouts.
Yeah, 88, 89.
Where are we now after 3 or 2 aborted trials and a final trial to get a conviction? What year are we? How
2004.
2004. Goodness me.
Yeah.
And he got a custodial sentence?
Yeah, he was convicted, 22 years maximum sentence, 16 non-parole period, but he ended up serving the whole 22 years. He'd make parole applications after the 16 years and they were always rejected.
Coming up, a stalker preys on Peter's own wife.
Peter, the next case we're going to discuss is particularly disturbing on a number of levels, not least of all the fact that it actually involves your wife. Are you okay just discussing this case with us?
Yeah, it was early in our marriage. We got married in 1985. I'd moved to Penrith Detectives in 1986, and Sue fell pregnant with the first pregnancy around that time. And I was doing a lot of landscaping at our house. We were on a sloping block, and I was doing wanted to do a lot of bushrock landscaping, retaining and that. And so I looked up, got a guy out of the local paper who had a lease at a property and sold bushrock, and ended up getting a couple of loads from him. And in hindsight, what had happened was that in working out delivery times when I could be there, we just got discussing, what I did. Told him I was in the police. And so what had happened is he would ring the police station at Penrith and ask for me. And if I was on afternoon shift starting at 3 o'clock, he'd ring after that when I wasn't home. If I was on day shift and finishing at 5, he'd ring around that time. And what it turned out, the second lot of rocks he delivered with his brother, and Sue was the one at home, and she brought out drinks. It was apparently a hot day. I wasn't there, and for some reason he would start ringing her at these times when he knew I wasn't there, and saying he was watching her, and that he was going to rape her, and how he was going to do it, and all these sorts of things. As it turned out, we found he was ringing from his girlfriend's home. And so we went through a process where Sue would have whistles, and she'd just blow the whistle as loudly as she could through the phone. And it didn't deter him. But then he'd go weeks without ringing again. And so you'd just get comfortable thinking, it was a one-off prank, some idiot. And then she'd get another call. And it really rocked her, as it would, a young girl, 22 years of age. She honestly thought that she was being watched because he knew when she was home and all that sort of stuff. At that time, Susie was pregnant, and during the whole course of these phone calls, she ended up having a miscarriage. The doctor said, look, she was really stressed out, and in my mind, that was a big part of it, if not the reason for it, what she was going through at the time. And as a husband, it's hard enough to see your wife dealing with this and not knowing how to fix it, but at least I was in a position in my career in my job as a police officer that I had the ability to do more about it than someone who was relying on someone else to do something. And the boss at Penrith, he gave me permission to work solely on that, put everything aside, on the proviso that when the time came that we had someone for it and we found who was doing it, I naturally had to step aside.
Sure.
And that was a logical thing.
Yeah.
It had to be done. So, yeah, I went through everything. I thought initially, because Susie was a school teacher, it might have been someone from through the school, went right through that, came up with nothing. In the end, I was able to get a listening device on the phone. We were able to track where the call came from. And again, that meant nothing to any of us because, as I said, he was ringing from his girlfriend's house. And I got to the point where I was left with nothing more than to bring the woman in. She was, I think, renting the house out there in one of the Mount Druitt suburbs.
And she'd be totally unaware that this was going on, obviously.
Had no idea.
And you're still at this point, there's no connection that you're making at this point to this bloke that delivered rocks to your joint months and months before.
None whatsoever.
Yeah.
So we were left with no other alternative but to bring her in. Calls are coming from her place. So we brought her in. I was working at St Mary's Detectives at the time. Brought her in, interviewed her, to the point where through my questioning of her, we established that the only male person that ever came to her house was her boyfriend. I then told her what the investigation was about and where's your boyfriend? And see, I knew him from the ad as Bob. She told me his name was Robert. And then
still no connection at that point?
At that time, still no connection. It's a name. Anyway, she said, he's at his grandparents' place. Can I go and get him? And I thought, well, that's good. I can buy a bit of time here. I said, you got half an hour. Bring him in or we're coming to get him. And that way I was able to ring the boss, get another couple of the detectives back, and I briefed them up on everything and they were ready to go. And
you could step back at that stage.
And I step back, step out of it and leave it to them to do the interviewing.
No doubt interested as to who's going to walk through the front door of the police station with her in half an hour, though.
Well, there was 4 detectives based at St Mary's at the time. So the boss, Detective Sergeant, he came back with his offsider. We had a chat, told him everything. He was right to go. And then we got the call from the uniform blokes that this Robert was here to see us. And when you came into the detective's office, I was sitting at a table to the left of the door. So as he walked through, he wouldn't have seen me straight away. But as he came through, as soon as I saw him, penny dropped.
How long is it since he'd been at the house at that point?
Maybe within a year or so.
Right.
But as soon as I saw him.
As soon as you saw him?
I knew.
The penny dropped.
The penny dropped.
Yeah.
Robert, Bob.
That's him.
I know. And it all of a sudden made sense, the connection.
Yeah.
And I jumped up straight away. And I won't tell you the thoughts going through my mind at that stage because I had a wife who had gone through that turmoil and suffered a miscarriage. And I was there when she was in Blacktown Hospital and they were doing the scans and we could see the little fetus there, but no heartbeat and everything. And then that went from there. And the boss saw my reaction and he just grabbed me, come out. Right, what the hell's going on? And I filled him in. There's a bloke who delivered bush rock to us. So everything all of a sudden made sense. Yeah. So he said, right, leave it with us. Yeah. They went in, interviewed him. He made full admissions and was charged. But at that time, because it was phone calls only, we could only charge him under the Telecommunications Act with making those sorts of phone calls. So there were a couple of counts of that he was charged with and went to court on.
As opposed to the nature of the discussions wasn't really part of it. It was more misuse of a phone and all the sort of a fairly minor offence considering what it is that he was saying to your wife. Look,
it carried a maximum penalty of 6 months jail.
Did he do a stretch? Did he?
And he went to Penrith Court. He pleaded guilty on both counts and he was sentenced to 6 months on both counts to be served concurrently.
So maximum sentence, I guess.
6 months. He was given the maximum due to the circumstances of what happened. Yeah,
plus conviction.
Yeah. He ultimately appealed the sentencing and went before the district court at Penrith. And I remember coming to the court, to the appeal, I was a bit late getting there because I had another court matter on that day. And I got there and as this guy was just finishing up his own evidence, in his defence, saying that my wife had abused his younger brother who had, don't know whether it was a form of autism or something. But yeah, that was his reason for doing what he did. And you know, I was filthy of it. That is so far from the truth. All Susie was doing was bringing them out drinks of water and looking after them. And I said to the DPP solicitor, I said, this didn't happen. You need to call me to rebut this. And he said, don't worry about it. He said, I can tell by the reaction of the Judge Collins that he's not accepting anything that was being said. Anyway, I said to him, you better be right. And we sat there. The judge said he was taking 15 minutes off the bench to consider his the submissions. And when he came back on, all he did was really give it to this guy and called him a coward, and he didn't accept anything that he said. And even if he did accept it, there's no reason to do the things that he was doing. And he said to him, and I'll never forget it, he said, the only consideration I've given is to whether to make the 2 6-month sentences from the learned magistrate to be served cumulatively, so one after the other.
Yeah, or concurrently,
so straight away, this guy was now staring at
looking at 12
months instead of 6. But the judge decided to leave it at what the magistrate had sentenced him to.
I mean, it's awful. You can't change what happened, but I suppose that's the best result you could have asked for.
That's right. It's at least it gave us answers.
Yes.
I'm often asked about when people say, it gives a final conclusion to families. I always think that when we do a job, it's not concluding things. We're just providing answers to the victims and families and that as to what happened. It's not over. Like Jean and Rosalina, their memories live on. So it's not over. It's not finished. All we did was get enough evidence to enable them to know what had happened.
If we've got somebody listening and going, okay, what would I do if I picked up that phone and I was receiving those calls, or I felt that somebody was following me or stalking me or outside the house? Peter, what would your advice be to any women listening in?
Report it to police and be in a position as best you can to give them as much information as you can. If you've got someone, say in this case with this guy ringing my wife, as best you can, a description of the voice, whether it sounds like a young person, old person, even some things like if they have a bit of a stutter or anything that may assist the police down the track. Because I've been involved in many investigations where there was a series of rapes on women, and the 4 victims, there were 4 victims in it, they all said the same thing: the offender wasn't circumcised. So information like that, it might not sound or seem important or relevant at the time, but it's vitally important to police. So any information over the phone that you can, if you hear a particular noise in the background, but you need to report it. And if you're not comfortable going there on your own, tell someone straight away and get them to go with you.
So don't think that there's nothing that can be done. Don't think, I don't want to bother the police. Don't think this won't be taken seriously. Look, I think I can speak for the majority of decent police. They would much rather hear about something like this before it sort of escalates than afterwards.
That's 100%.
You made a decision to step away from frontline policing, away from the round the clock roster. And you stepped across into, I believe, police prosecutions. Is that right?
Yes, it was in 1992. I was at Penrith Detectives, and I had it in the back of my head because I've got 3 daughters. They were all young, and it just felt right that I needed to give my wife and the kids a bit of a break from the shift works and things. And I was in the office one day, and I happened to see an old detective mate who had gone across to the prosecutors, walking down the corridor to the prosecutor's office. And it just dawned on me, well, that's a natural progression for me to go to the prosecutors. 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, spend more time at home, with the family and give back to them for everything they've had to sacrifice. And so I made those inquiries, and to cut a long story short, the boss supported me. He understood the reasons why. And I ended up in 1992 joining the police prosecuting branch.
And you got to the point where you were a coronial prosecutor. Is that right? Can you just explain that role?
Yes. After 2 years doing general prosecuting work in the local courts and children's courts, I was sent to Westmead Coroner's Court one day to help fill in. And I went there and just enjoyed that jurisdiction. The Coroner's Court is not an adversarial court. It's a inquisitorial court because the coroner is wanting to find the truth of what's happened. And the coroner deals with both deaths and fires, suspicious deaths. Where it's a suspicious death, be a homicide or a suicide, then there'll be an inquest. And so as a prosecutor at the Coroner's Court, you're the sergeant assisting the coroner. It's not an adversarial thing, but you're assisting the coroner. You've worked directly at the court with the coroner. You've gone through the brief. In those days, we'd read the brief. We'd put a recommendation to the coroner on whether an inquest needed to be held or whether it could be dispensed with. So you have a very close working relationship with the coroner, and it's just presenting all the evidence. There's rules of evidence that don't apply. Like people can give opinions in the coroner's court where they're prohibited unless they're a professional in the local courts and the other court jurisdictions. And I just found it very interesting. So I went there in 1994 and I was there for 6 years.
So after 6 years as a stint police prosecution plus in the coronial environment, you returned to frontline duties in 2000. And you're very much in the deep end. You're involved in a violent homicide investigation in the western suburbs of Sydney. Yeah,
it was 2000, around June, July. I'd been approached earlier by Detective Sergeant Mick Lyons, who I worked with in the Keir murder, and we'd always kept in touch. We were good mates, and he rang me one day at the Coroner's Court and said, have you ever thought about coming back to the detectives? He said, we've got a spot out here at St Mary's. And I thought after 8 years in the prosecuting area, the kids had grown up, and I thought, maybe it's time to go back to it. And so I spoke to Susie, and she said, look, it's your career. I'll support whatever you do. So I ended up back at St Mary's Detectives, and it's one of those things, you be careful what you wish for. Talking to Mick, we're having a cup of coffee in the back veranda early in the piece, and I said, I need a good investigation to get myself back in the swing of things after 8 years. I need a good murder or something, just as an off-the-cuff, bit of a joke, really. But be careful what you wish for, because it wasn't long after that, and I wasn't even the on-call detective this night, but I got the phone call in the early hours of the morning that there was a body found on Mamre Road at St Mary's, the main street, and looked like a possible homicide, and I was called in.
It was pretty nasty one.
The body was there. It looked like a potential assault because he had some grazes and cuts and some bruising to his head. And he was on the corner of Mamre Road and Edgar Street at St Mary's. And there was nothing around. And we had street lights. Mamre Road's the main road that runs through to St Mary's. And we had absolutely nothing other than this body with some head injuries. So I called the scientific out, normal protocol. I got the forensic pathologist out. And it was funny because to get a post-mortem carried out on the weekends, you got to get approval from the coroner for the pathologist to carry it out. And so
you'd have had a few contacts there, I'd imagine.
Well, the coroner at the time, Jan Stevenson, I worked with her closely at the Coroner's Court for the last couple of years, and she was the one that was heavily involved in the Keir murder by calling the homicide squad in and basically demanding that the bones be taken over to America. Because the coroner runs that investigation. The police do the investigations on behalf of the coroner. So I rang Jan's mobile. The first thing I did was apologise to her for the time that I was ringing early in the morning. And as it turned out, she was on holidays, unbeknown to me, and she was over in France. She said, I'm having croissant and whatever. She said, what have you got? Anyway, she gave the approval to call the pathologist.
This is a classic example of you're a detective, you're on the scene, there's a deceased body on the side of the road, a fairly busy road, the west of Sydney, Mamre Road. what for all accounts looks like a homicide. How do you go from there to identifying offenders and getting a case like that into court? I mean, there's a lot of plates that are spinning there, a lot of things that need to come into play.
There sure is. It's at that time we had no information to go on. It's 1:30 in the morning. There's no one around. It's quiet. First thing is you got to identify the deceased, which we were able to do. And it turns out he was only 250 metres from home. Once we identify him, we then have to look at his movements. Where had he been? Where was he going to? And who had seen him? All those sorts of things. So, and the first thing that came to my mind was at that hour of the morning, there wouldn't be too many people around. Where can we find CCTV? Around the corner is the St Mary's Band Club. Up the road was a mobile service station. Alongside that, an RSL club. So straight away, they were the targets to go and see what CCTV they had at the time to show who was potentially around at that time. So we did all that, and it was actually the CCTV from the service station that showed up the two persons responsible for it.
So Nick Haynes, who's the victim of this attack, you'd be scrolling through all the CCTV footage, and so you see him walking past. He's picked up, is he?
No, it wasn't him that was picked up.
Right.
We'd actually found through the investigation that he'd been down to the band club.
Yes.
He'd had quite a bit to drink. He'd also been down to the local pub near there. But then we found that he called into the local pizza shop near the club on the Great Western Highway there. The guy there knew him quite well and said, yeah, he was here. He said he'd had quite a bit to drink and he actually fell asleep eating his pizza. And I sent him on his way. He said, Nick, got to get home. He was the last person to see him.
Right.
But what we did a media interview because we had no witnesses, nothing. And out of that media coverage, two young witnesses, two young boys came forward. They were actually walking home. They'd got a train home. I think they were around 17, 18. And they were walking along the road on the opposite side to where Nick was walking, but in the same direction as him. And they both said, and we interviewed them separately when they came forward, that two young blokes approached Nick at the corner and they couldn't hear a lot of what was said, but it seemed to them that they assaulted him, and one of the witnesses heard mention of a wallet. But at the scene, we did locate Nick's wallet and there was still a bit of money left in there, so we didn't think robbery was really a motive at that time. But when these witnesses were interviewed, one of the boys said it did hear them say something about get your wallet.
Right.
So straight away we had descriptions.
Yes.
And these two suspects were like chalk and cheese. One was a tall, thin, bleach blonde-haired Caucasian male. The other one was a lot shorter, black hair, and was of Islander appearance.
Okay.
And their clothing stood out. The Islander person had dark jacket and dark clothes. The other guy had like a light-coloured tracksuit with a stripe on it. So we had fairly distinctive descriptions, although they didn't get to see their faces. But the two boys, they said that when this was all happening, I think it was the Islander fella turned around and looked at them, and so they took off. They thought, we're going to cop this too. So they took off. And it wasn't until they saw the media coverage a day or so later that they realised that's what they'd seen.
And they came forward.
Their parents contacted us.
What good lads, huh? And I mean, they're crucial to an investigation like this, aren't they?
They are. They are.
And was it from there with a timeline you could go back and piece it together through some CCTV footage and that type of thing? Yeah,
well then that's where the CCTV footage was invaluable because now we knew they came from the direction of the RSL club and the service station as opposed to anywhere else because the two boys said they were approaching Nick. So we trawled through all the CCTV from around that time, half hour or so beforehand, and the CCTV from the service station was very grainy. It really wasn't good quality. But as I'm going through it, all of a sudden these two blokes stand out. They come into the service station, buy something, and then out they go. And from the descriptions of the two boys, that was them.
And quite, because there's two of them as well, very distinctive in how different they were. Even though it's a grainy image, it's enough to, there's no doubt this is who it is.
No doubt. The clothing matched, the description matched, because it was chalk and cheese. And then the timeline fitted from getting from where they were at the service station to when the boys saw them with Nick. But then that's all we had. We still didn't know who they were. Couldn't see their faces. The grainy footage was terrible. You couldn't see their faces on that. So then the decision had to be made. Do we potentially burn one of the two boys by getting him to come in and positively identify the two offenders from that footage? So from a point of court evidence is concerned, to push them along that line of saying, oh, have a look at this, potentially could wipe them out as a witness because of doing the identification that way. And I spoke to the homicide. They suggested I err on the side of caution and not do it. End up speaking to the Crown Prosecutor's office at Penrith, and although they really can't give us that sort of advice, the inference was probably, again, err on the side of caution. But me being who I am, thought, no, I've got nothing else. I'm going to do it. Then I had to decide which one was probably the better one to keep for court, who I thought would stand up better. Yeah. And so I got the other guy in, and my boss at St Mary's, he backed me 100%. So we got him in. I gave him the warnings and said, I just want you to look at this, and if there's anything you see that you need to tell me about, I'll stop it at that point. If not, we're all good. And so I let him in probably at least 15 minutes or so, maybe beforehand. I didn't start it right at that time because I wanted him to see other people moving in and out of the service station. And when it got to the time, because there was a time frame on the screen where they were going to come into view, I particularly watched him. And then all of a sudden when these two offenders came into view, he just leant forward at the screen and he looked at it and he said, that's them.
Bang.
And pointed at them, and without blinking an eye. So I let that roll through a bit further until they walked out, and then I got a statement off him positively identifying him. And as it turned out, the way we did all that was still admitted into evidence. The Crown Prosecutor said it was probably a really good decision to do it that way.
Right, yeah. And so you've identified through the two witnesses and CCTV footage visually who those two offenders are, but you now have to identify who they actually are.
That's where the old foot slog detectives' work comes into it, talking to people, rattling a few cages and getting people to talk about it. And then all of a sudden there was a phone call to St Mary's Police Station one day from an anonymous person giving us a name of the taller blonde-haired guy.
Yep.
And that was it. So then came the situation of trying to find who that informant was. So we did phone traces around the time the call was received at St Mary's, and we came up with about 8 or 9 phone calls that came in around that time. And Murphy's Law would have it. It was the very last one I went to. As soon as I knocked on the door, this lady opened the door and I identified myself to her. And she said, I was wondering how long it would take for you to come and see me. I said, you rang the police station? She said, yes, I did. I said, I need to talk to you. She gave me the information that she had and where she'd got it from. I then interviewed those people. They confirmed everything. And, that's how we ultimately, through just word of mouth and people coming forward, putting it all together and interviewing them. And then we did search warrants at the two offenders' houses simultaneously, split into 2 teams, and both persons were arrested.
And charged with homicide? Charged
with murder, with a backup charge of manslaughter.
And motivation robbery at the end of it all, do you think? Or just 2 blokes who saw a drunk bloke and started to
The second scenario,
Yeah.
they came across him
Yep.
and had words with him. He was
Yep.
drunk, so
Yep.
whether he actually
Said
said something
yeah.
back, and there were a few punches and kicks thrown. And the other twist to this is when they did the post-mortem, they found that Nick had a really bad heart. So he was a ticking time bomb, really, with his heart.
Right.
And the pathologist said to me, look, he could have died at any time, really. And I said to her, but for evidence for court, if he hadn't have been assaulted and he had all those marks and that he was belted around the head and that, if that hadn't have happened, he may very well still be alive today, albeit with a bad heart. And she said, that's correct. So with that information, that forensic evidence gave us enough to be able to charge them with the murder.
This is a case, Peter, am I right in saying that brought up a few issues for yourself around that time? And this is, you're now 20 years in the job, and a lot of blokes and women who have sat on your side of the desk have said, it's like that, it's that water dripping into the bucket. It just keeps filling up. It just keeps filling up.
In a nutshell, yes. And you're doing that investigation, you've got a lot of pressure on you. Families are looking to you to find out what happened and to find the offenders responsible. There's a lot of pressure on police especially murder investigations, and you do feel that pressure. But in between time, you've got other jobs you're working on. Around that time, I was involved in an investigation of a little missing 3-year-old, and ultimately she was found in the backyard pool, but they'd scraped the pool initially. The pool hadn't been cleaned. The filter hadn't been running for all winter and that, and the water was just green. You couldn't see in.
Yeah.
When I came into that investigation, they'd said they'd scraped the pool. There was nothing in it. So we had a missing 3-year-old. After a couple of days, I got them to go back through the pool. And in hindsight, and this came up in the debrief, what I should have done was drain the pool straight away. But hindsight's a wonderful thing. I was going off what I was told, but we drained it again, and that's where they came across the little one at the bottom of the pool. And I was there when we recovered the body, sat with the parents. They had to do the formal identification. Things like that catch up with you.
Yeah.
When I was younger and single, you'd go through and do jobs. I've been lucky to get away with a couple of incidents where I walked past a guy who had a big carving knife at a break and enter. Why he didn't use it on me as I walked through the door, I don't know. Another one, a guy early hours of the morning grabbed my partner's gun and I was on top of him trying to reach around to stop him from pulling the trigger, and then my partner reached down and I could feel his hand twist around and he said, don't pull the trigger, son, because gun goes off, it's going through you. And I'm thinking, hang on, I'm on his back. It's going to go through him and through me too. So I've been lucky. I've got away with it a couple of times with my life. But you don't think about it too much then. You have a bit of a chat about it as we did in the old days and have a couple of beers and it's dealt with. But then when you have your own kids, and especially my experience at the coroner's court, seeing everything that I've seen, how people have died, suicides, pool drownings, things of that nature, that bucket started to fill up pretty quick.
So 2004, you're thinking, I'm done.
It was actually 2003 where I broke down. I was heading to work one day and stopped at a set of lights and, I just broke down.
Just hit you?
Yeah.
Out of nowhere?
Yeah, out of nowhere. I could have just driven and kept driving, not caring where I was driving to. I just didn't want to go to work. I ended up going to work, but it was at the debrief for the pool drowning I just spoke about. An old work colleague I'd worked with in the police back in the late 80s, he'd become a psychologist and he attended the debrief and he gave me his card. He was local to Penrith and he said, mate, you can't keep doing this line of work. Come and talk to me if you ever need me. And it was probably only 12 months or so later that I broke down and I pulled out Mark's card and I rang him. I said, I need to talk. And he said, look, come in, we'll have a half-hour chat. Just, see how things are. And I made that appointment, went and saw him, and it was about 2.5 hours later that I left his office and he told me he'd never go back to work again. And that was it.
That was it.
12 months later, technically I was still in the police while the paperwork was going through. February 2004, I was medically discharged.
Right.
And I had to see a psychiatrist, a specialist, in between times.
Mm.
And I went and saw him, went through everything. And that's when things from the past do get dredged up.
Mm.
And it just gets on top of you. And this psychiatrist said, I had symptoms of a Vietnam veteran. And I said, you got to be kidding. You know, those poor buggers have been in a war zone, been shot at. He said it's the death. It's the constant death that you've been subjected to.
And over 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said that's what it is, because I'd be waking up around 3 o'clock every morning. It's like a switch goes on and you wake up. Sometimes I get back to sleep. Sometimes I wouldn't. The nightmares, and the worst nightmares were ones involving my kids in scenes I'd been to, like train fatalities and car fatalities, but my kids would be the victims, and I'd wake up, it'd be the middle of winter, but I'd wake up sweating in a lather of sweat, and I'd wake Susie up. And again, this is the flow-on effect.
Yeah.
It's not just a person going through it, but it's their immediate family and that see what's going on and have to deal with that as well.
Since leaving the job, you've penned a couple of true crime books. No better opportunity to tell us perhaps just a little bit about those, because both of those cases that you've been kind enough to speak to us about today were the subject of those two books.
Yeah, the first one is called 7 Bones, because that's the number of bones that we found of Jean's body under the house. And I never intended to write the book, but it was a coroner that convinced me to write about that. And I had a few goes at it and put it away, but then I thought there's got to be a reason to write a book, apart from it being a bizarre investigation. And then it dawned on me one day driving home that it was a domestic violence murder, and what these two women were subjected to shouldn't happen. And that gave me the motivation to write it. I thought if it helps someone. With the Nick Haynes murder, the publisher said, look, the 7 Bones book went so well, it touched a chord with a lot of readers. Can you do another one? And I thought, well, what would be the reason for that book? Because it wasn't an investigation that had the twists and turns of the 7 Bones investigation. In other words, well, if I open up and talk about what was happening to me and the post-traumatic stress and the effects on the family, then that's probably a good reason to write that book. Yes, it's about the murder, but intertwined around that murder investigation story was what was going on personally. Yeah. And I thought, well, if that can help emergency services people that may read the book, or other people, family members that say, oh, I can relate to that, or, you know, my husband or wife or family member, yeah, I can see changes in them along those lines, well, then that might help them. Yeah. And that was a reason. All of a sudden I had a reason to write that book.
Did you find that assisted you and was in some ways, it's probably the wrong term, therapeutic for yourself to process that and to put that down into writing?
I get asked that quite a bit, and whether it had a negative effect on me or a positive effect, and really not one more than the other. As I said, I suddenly had the reason to write it, to put it out there. That was all I needed to put it together. And then once I got invested in writing the story and putting in what was happening to me to make it worthwhile to me, it just sort of flowed from there. It didn't cause me a lot of grief, put it that way, no more than what I've been through, and I suppose, you know, I continue to go through, still have the nightmares and still wake up every night. It's just something that I accept, and I know what's happening. There are times where you can never pick what may trigger it, where, yeah, I know I'm just not myself. You know, you get quiet, things upset you. You know, I've got a pool, and I have the grandkids come over and they play in the pool, but I look at what can happen if they're not being watched. I see that side of it as opposed to kids having a great time in the pool. And unfortunately, that's just the way things are.
And just on that, Peter, you're almost 20 years out of the job, and we're sitting here and you're saying you're still nighttime waking up, still those nightmares, and still those times where you're reflecting back on that stuff that happened now nearly 40 years ago.
Yeah, it doesn't stop. Yeah, it doesn't go away. There's no cut-off point to it. It's you've been through it, you dealt with it, your brain, your mind knows it's happened, and any single thing you might be something on the news, it might be something you see, might be a person you see that brings back a memory, and subconsciously in the nighttime, that's what happens.
This is the 30th chat that I've had with both serving and past police from all around Australia, and this has been one of the most enjoyable chats that I've had, and I know from feedback that we've had from other interviews that there will be so many folks who listen to this who will take so much from what you've been so open and honest about, telling us. That diving into those cases was amazing, but also your honesty with regards to the price that you individually and others pay. And I just want to thank you, Peter, for coming in. I want to thank you for being so open and candid, and also, for that 24 years of service to the folks of Western Sydney, and for putting what we've spoken about into print. And I know that many people listening will pick up and run with that as well. So just thanks so much, and I know a lot of people are going to benefit from this discussion.
Thank you. No, it's my pleasure, and I've spoken about them a few times at different forums, and to me, it's all about getting that message out. And if it helps someone, then that's a win.
Fantastic. Thanks, mate.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.